Okay, you should be able to see my screen, Isaac?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, well, welcome everyone to this talk on open educational resources for art history. My name is Karla McManus, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Visual Arts, where I teach art history. And today I'm going to talk about how I use OER and some AER resources as well for teaching art history, and also in my own research, obviously, and why I think it's useful and valuable to consider using OER in any kind of disciplinary topic. So here's a little introduction to the idea of open education. In art history, there's a group in Canada called Open Art Histories, and I've included a link here. And they describe open educational resources as freely accessible, openly licensed resources that can be used for teaching, learning, assessment, and research purposes. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this group, here is a link to their website where they provide links to mostly Canadian-based, but also international art history sources that are open educational resources, and also talk about their own initiatives in pedagogy and research. So I'm going to talk about kind of three ways that I use OER and AER resources. So there is the traditional, which is using course readings. You know, in art history, we, like many humanities, we rely heavily on getting students to read art historical texts. The literature is essential to understanding the discipline, and also, you know, as a history-based discipline, there are a lot of facts and details students need to understand. So we always get them to do quite a bit of reading. So I have for many years now relied on university libraries systems. At the University of Regina, we use the Leganto system, which provides affordable educational resources. So you can obviously get the library to make you what is essentially a course pack, drawing on different sources. I also use a fair number of open educational resources, and this has been something that I've really embraced as a result of teaching online through the pandemic. Web-based scholarly sources have been growing as a resource for many years, but the pandemic really demonstrated to all of us how important these sources can be to offer different voices and provide students with kind of ways of learning that are outside of the traditional text. So a lot of web-based scholarly sources include videos and images in different ways that art history students and visual arts students really respond to. So this leads into my second point, which is the way that I use asynchronous course content. So asynchronous course content is really based on the idea of the flipped classroom, a model in university teaching that has gotten some traction of late, and really argues that students cannot just sit in a classroom lecture for 3 hours. So we need to give them time to absorb, to reflect, and also just to let their brains rest between ideas that we're presenting. So if I'm going to be lecturing for a period of time, I like to provide some time where students go away and they, in their own time frame, do kind of asynchronous course content. And a lot of this can be really fun educational content that helps teach critical skills, and also, again, present alternative voices, not just my voice and opinion on the topic. Because of course, teaching art history, like every other humanities discipline, becomes very dominated by the voice of the instructor. So I provide them with links to videos that allow them to see art objects in situ, maybe in their original place, if they're, say, a piece of public art, or in an institution or museum. These videos can also give them a sense of the size of objects that they're studying, which is often completely distorted in the presentations that we give in the traditional slide lecture format. Web essays and articles that aren't necessarily scholarly sources, but come from the perspective of an expert, so maybe an art critic or a curator who has written something. Exhibition reviews are great resources. Sometimes also artists' voices can be profiled in this way, either interviews or written works about their own art. Finally, gray literature, which are generally documents that are not published by traditional publishers, right, but which are produced by institutions. So those could include internal documents by museums, new policies that are developing through the Canada Council for the Arts, sending them to look at gray literature. And sometimes I also include archival content that's been curated. So I'm going to show you some examples of this in a moment. All of these resources really enrich students' understanding of what art history is, and also allow different voices to come into the discussion, whether it's a discussion about, how Canadian art galleries collect, or it's a discussion about the issues of restitution, returning art objects to traditional, the traditional countries and communities that they come from. So this opens up the dialogue around these issues and allows different debates to enter in. Finally, the third method that I think is important to emphasize, and which is really disciplinary specific for the visual arts and art history, but is important for others who use images to also consider, is the way that images are used in lectures. So in art history, in the Web 2.0 world, we're really seeing a challenge that is facing students in that they don't always understand how to source accurate images. And by that, I mean images that represent correctly the original object being presented. And there's also the ethical image that needs to be considered. So has the image come from a source that has the right to reproduce it? So all of this has to do with modeling proper academic practices for students, but also enlarging their understanding of what is included in the disciplinary skills of art history. So like I said, in terms of assigning course readings, I'm looking to use library resources. Students pay for the library through their tuition. So I'm saving them money by not having them buy textbooks. We're also, by making, say, a course pack or alternative list of readings, we're also breaking with the challenge or the problematic of the holistic textbook, the one textbook written by one author that claims the authority on that topic. So we can privilege multiple voices by using different essays, book chapters, articles by different authors. And it also allows you not to be dominated or dictated to by the textbook. You can create a course your way. It takes a little bit more forethought, but it is really integral to my teaching methodology. Now, here I'm showing you an example of an online resource that I have used to talk about the issues of contemporary museum collections. Here is a site from the University of Michigan's Museum of Art, which they've created to make public their investigation into some objects that fall within the category of the Benin bronzes, which is a group of artworks that have been looted from the Kingdom of Benin in the early 20th century. Now, this is a vast group of art objects, many thousands, that ended up spreading onto the global art market over many decades. And, most famously, they're found in big institutions like the British Museum, the Louvre, or the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but even small institutions like the University of Michigan Museum of Art have objects that fall into the kind of grouping of this Benin society that was essentially destroyed by invading British soldiers who reacted to like a diplomatic incident by essentially destroying the kingdom itself and looting all their art objects. So this is a very fascinating website because it allows students to look at the objects and see the process of research that the institution is going through. So such sites really reveal so much about the history of museums and also the contemporary debates and issues that we're facing in art history. So it's an example of a great online resource. So as I mentioned, this idea of asynchronous content allows, there are many great sources. There's videos provided by museums. There's scholarly websites. So I'm showing you one here, which is a scholarly web resource. It's the Art Canada Institute, where they have a series of books written by scholars in Canada, primarily on Canadian artists. They're very short books that can be downloaded or read online. So I have used this website, for example, to have students do book reviews. They get to choose an artist and then introduce that artist to their peers through a presentation. And this allows us to talk about the history of Canadian art, how that narrative has been told and structured, and to think more broadly about some of the issues that have shaped that narrative. Gray literature is becoming more and more interesting and available online. And so here I'm showing you just briefly a series of photographs. And in this, I count these photographs as kind of gray literature because they're documentation of the very first, the inaugural exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York that took place November to December in 1929, an exhibition that featured some of the most, important modern artists of the time. So students can click through these photos and see how they were installed and get a sense of the scope of such an exhibition, the size of those art objects in the space, and how curators in that time period framed and presented and interpreted these objects for audiences. So this is an amazing resource, particularly if you're kind of interested in breaking free from the dominant narrative of the great white male genius artists. There's also, the idea of our history from below. So web resources have been really helping us to highlight the stories of our histories in different parts of the world. So on one hand, I'm showing you the scholarly OER Art History resource, Smart History, which has a series of videos and articles written by scholars on various topics. In this case, the history of a Peruvian type of bottle from a very interesting collection that is housed in New York. And then on the right, I have showing you TARA, the Trust for African Rock Art, which is an organization spearheaded, a nonprofit involving scholars and local communities who want to draw attention and help to preserve the amazing history of rock art in that continent. So my third point to return to is the importance of using images accurately and ethically. So many students are very versed in the visual language of the internet, and we all kind of know how to use Google image searches or some kind of image search. And so here I just did Van Gogh sunflowers as a search, and the image I'm showing you is demonstrating the vast variety of images that came up. I hesitate to call them photographs because some of them aren't photographs, not anymore. They are altered. Some of them are images of Van Gogh's work, but you can notice that even in the works that look similar. So for example, we have a repetition of a number of his sunflower paintings. There is color differences. And this raises a really important concern for art history. When students are accessing images to study, they need to be sure they come from either a museum or some kind of scholarly source that has vetted the image, because otherwise they may be looking at an image that is inaccurate, that has been altered, cropped, added to. It's impossible to know. So students must accurately source images. And this is part of modeling proper academic practice. So when I show images, I also try to identify the source that I get it from. So one of the main sources that we have through the University of Regina's John Archer Library is Art Store, which is available with registration. There are other open educational image sources that students can use as well. So I draw their attention to museums that make their images available for CC, Creative Commons download. Also, of course, Smart History and other art history scholarly OER sources have images that are properly cited and sourced. But I always try to get students to engage a little bit with ArtStore as part of an assignment so that they know that there is such a thing as a properly sourced image. And this is, to emphasize that images of artworks are like scholarly written sources. We have to treat them as questionable and accurate when they're used properly. So here is the image that I got of Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers from ArtStore, showing you, the texture and the coloration that the original painting today holds. I say today because, of course, paintings do change over time and it may have discolored, but that's a whole other story. But at the very least, students have to learn and have to understand that not all images that they find on the web are images that they should be using to study art objects. Okay, and finally, I just want to draw attention to the fantastic visual arts research sources that are available through the library guide. So Michael Shires is my area librarian, and I always get my students to go to this site and understand some of the great sources available. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Karla. I have a question for you about these.
Sure.
I remember that there was, I think it's a chair from Ghana that was in, I think it was in the UK, that they were trying to get, for a while, I think they were trying to get it back.
Yeah.
So how do they actually get those things back?
Well, it's a great question. It's so dependent, and many institutions are not, they're not happy to get rid of to give things back, right? So it really they have to provide evidence generally. Like the burden is on either the nation or the community or the original owner, if possible, to provide evidence that they know this object was acquired illegally, or at very least it once belonged to someone, that they can prove that it belonged to that person or that community. They have to prove that somehow it ended up on the illegal market, right?
Right.
Now, it's a case-by-case situation. The Benin bronze story is really helping to highlight how quickly and easily things end up being legitimized, at least historically, on the market. So provenance research is one of the key components to any good art historical evidence. You have to demonstrate the historical provenance, how it came into a collection.
Right.
Usually there's a document record. But of course, many places like the original Kingdom of Benin was completely destroyed. They didn't have documentation, right? But what they do have is, their own cultural knowledge about these objects. And so, in that case, it's so obvious that these objects were basically stolen.
Right.
Others are not as clear cut. And currently there's a big debate about the second piece to this is demonstrating that the community that the object belongs in, that they will be able to support its proper display and protection of the object. So many institutions like the British Museum, notoriously, right? The Elgin marbles is the big example there. They refuse to return the Elgin marbles, which were located on the Parthenon, because they claim that Greece cannot guarantee their safety. Right? Well, that's a particularly difficult argument to swallow for many, especially because they have built a specific museum to house them and they're just waiting for their return. But unfortunately, Africa has, really been having to fight an uphill battle. There's been, in France, there's been an interesting discussion around this because, of course, France has a historic collection of colonial objects from Africa, from former African nations that they controlled. And Emmanuel Macron, the current ruler or president of France, has stated that he'd like to return some of these objects. Now, the museum community in France was not too happy to have him stick his nose into this debate, but it actually has kind of pushed forward that discussion more. So it's part of diplomatic negotiations, actually, in many cases. It's gotten very complicated.
Well, I mean, it seems strange to me that you would stipulate how somebody else, whom you took something from, should take care of it.
Yeah.
Seems a little bit odd.
Oh, I know. It's kind of horrific. It's definitely a form of cultural colonialism. But it has a big part of the conflict has to do with how museums, particularly in the West, in Europe and North America, have developed this idea of conservation and preservation of objects as being preeminent. So even like, for example, in many, for many First Nations communities in Canada who have been trying to get objects back from, say, the Scottish Museum or the British Museum, they can argue for their spiritual and cultural significance. But if they cannot demonstrate that they have, say, a space in which an object that is extremely fragile, made of natural materials, if they can't demonstrate they have a space that they can house that object, many of these institutions, they prioritize the protection of the object over its cultural significance to the community. So recently there was an object returned to Saskatchewan, and I don't remember the First Nations community that it belongs to, but they have now housed it in the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. So it's closer, right? But it's not maybe kept in place as people would like.
Right. So this is part of the whole, what is it, this whole decolonization, all that sort of conversation.
Exactly. Yeah, most certainly. And it fundamentally comes down to the idea of like, what is art, or what are cultural objects for? In our defining of these objects as art, we remove them from their traditional usage, and we say they should be kept in a museum behind glass or on a plinth, rather than being used in a way that may lead to their damage and disintegration, because that's how they were originally intended to be used.
Right. Yeah, because I remember the stool from Ghana was something that I don't remember what tribe it was, but it was something that the king sat on.
Right.
And
yeah,
I mean, it's not, like you say, it's not to be.
It's not. Yeah, stored. It's not meant to be, behind glass. It's a seat. It's an important seat, but it's still a seat. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So there's like very fundamental questions about, what we define as art, how that leads to certain kind of attitudes and practices around conserving objects to the detriment of their social and religious and cultural significance. So, yeah,
this is a big topic.
It's a big topic.
Yes.
It's an important one to the topic of art history, but yes, it's not going to change overnight.
No. Yeah. I mean, I know in what they call the scramble for Africa, the French, the Portuguese, the Italians, Spanish, somewhat, mostly, and then of course the English. I think the English were the main culprits because their empire was so vast at the time. They were everywhere.
Yeah.
And I know this conversation, things from Africa that found themselves somewhere in the UK, from India and all over Asia that found themselves in the UK. And
oh yeah, I mean, it's there's this great little documentary on this topic I could share with you. It's like half an hour. It's on Vimeo. I got my students to watch it. It was actually made by a student, and she interviews a bunch of experts and talks about the British Museum because it's the greatest museum in the world. Like, I love going to the British Museum. It's incredible. Like, to see all that culture in one place. It's brilliant. I mean, this is what we're taught to revere too. For those of us who love museums, the idea of an encyclopedic museum, the idea of being able to access all this different fantastic culture in one place, like, who doesn't love that idea? But of course, it's completely founded on colonial practices of collecting and preserving that colonial legacy.
Right.
Culturally, if not actually politically. we are preserving it, right? Saying this is the center of the universe. If you want to see these objects, you have to come to London.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm always every now and then I'll watch something on the BBC and they'll be talking about some of these things. And more recently, I've been watching. Recently there was, I think, an Egyptian mummy that was returned to Egypt.
Oh, interesting.
Recently.
Yeah, I mean, there are examples, like there are countries, case studies like the Benin Bronze is one of them. Egypt has a very long history of, being involved in archaeology and sort of managing the different influences. Of course, it's a very unique case study because Egypt changed hands colonially, but the British sort of ran it, and then the French were running it, and then they ended up developing a kind of pan-European kind of management system for Egyptology. And then today it's run by a ministry. Like, it's so important to the country of Egypt, right? Tourism, Egyptology, it's a major moneymaker. So tourism is always wrapped up in this, right? I mean, the bust of Nefertiti is still in Germany. Many of the important objects, they were legally sold though. So it's not as clear cut as something that was looted, right?
Right.
So it gets very complicated. Egypt has the original architecture, right? So people still go there for that.
Right.
And they do have a museum, but if you go to the museum in Cairo, the interpretation is nothing like what you'll experience if you go to the British Museum's Egypt section. It's not, they don't have the same museological focus. So, and for many, when I visited Egypt many years ago now, but when I visited, I really had a strong sense that for contemporary Egyptians, they have a really mixed relationship with that history, because it's not religiously, there's conflict with some of what Islam, promotes in terms of, idolatry and so you have to be really a fan of this history, right? Not everyone embraces ancient Egypt as their predecessor in Egypt today. It's a long time ago. Right? But we have said this is what Egypt's all about.
Right. Right.
So
I watched a show on BBC and they have, what was interesting to me is, of course, there's American, British Egyptologists, but what was interesting to me is the Egyptian ones that are there.
Yeah.
How they're so fascinated by digging up all of this stuff that's part of their history.
Yeah.
Which I haven't seen before I started watching this show.
Well, and this changed, and I don't know the whole political history, but like Egypt controls Egyptology today and has for quite some time. But they do get a lot of funding still from European groups. Germans, the French, and the English are still heavily involved in investing in digs and in the collections. So it's become, like I said, it's a very important part of their economy, and it's also, it's a political issue as well, obviously. Like Egyptian Egyptologists are in control of the sites.
Right.
So they sort of have managed that well, but it wasn't always the case, obviously.
Right.
And they still don't have, like the return of Nefertiti's head. They do have some, many of the objects, because very early on in Egyptology, like in the early 20th century, even though it was being run by Europeans, they had instituted the museum in Cairo, and they had begun to amass a collection there. So while there was a lot of illegal sales through archaeology, it wasn't a very clean industry, let's say, a
Right.
cultural industry. There was a lot of like diverting objects here and there.
Right.
They did from very early on, and Europeans were part of this, like protected the collection of the country of Egypt,
Right.
developing that. So it's much different than what's gone on case by case. It's so different.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Why?
Yeah.
This would be an interesting study to do.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah. I
All
will
right.
stop the recording.
Yeah.